June 27, 1944. 1,640 hours. Northern outskirts of Cannes, France. The last artillery strike had shaken the fractured neighborhood into a haze of drifting mortar dust and pulverized brick. The ruins vibrated under distant tank engines that echoed between collapsed walls. Private Arthur Jenkins crouched behind a shattered corner of a three-story apartment block that had become nothing more than a jagged L-shaped spine of concrete and red brick. The street ahead once held bakeries and tailor shops. Now it held only wrecked carts, torn bodies, and muffled groans from wounded men hidden under debris. The battalion had pushed into this district at dawn, hoping to secure a foothold before German counterattacks stiffened. By afternoon, communication lines had collapsed under the weight of shelling, smoke, and dead runners. Jenkins could feel the pressure of that failure in every choice made on the ground. He was 24 and built like the construction worker he once was. Thick forearms, steady hands, and an eye that judged distances through instinct rather than calculation. Before the war he spent years on demolition crews in Ohio. He studied the way buildings sagged under controlled blast. He tracked how dust plumes behaved in narrow corridors or open lots. He learned how mortar dust hung heavier than brick dust, how brick layers fractured at predictable angles, and how a small charge could create a vertical plume that stayed visible just long enough for workers to signal each other across a noisy site. War gave him little comfort, but it gave him familiar terrain whenever artillery collapsed a structure. Art stayed low while Sergeant Collier crawled toward him with a grim look. The sergeant's uniform was torn and coated with dust. His helmet carried a deep dent from last night's firefight. He whispered that the radio was dead. The wire team had been shredded at noon. 2 runners had already gone missing trying to reach 3rd Platoon. Battalion expected resistance in this district. They did not expect full machine gun nests, sniper posts in upper floors, and mortar teams bracketing every alley. Communications doctrine assumed flares or colored panels would signal orders, but thick smoke from burning timber and crushed insulation blocked everything above the 2nd story. The platoon had no visibility and no way to receive or send orders. Art peeked around the rubble. A field of shifting haze drifted through the boulevard. Explosions from German mortars kicked dust high, but the clouds mixed with dark smoke and vanished before any pattern could form. Yet Art noticed something. Small bursts of bright red brick dust rose sharper than the pale gray mortar clouds behind them. They cut through the background haze for a second before dissolving. His mind locked on that moment. He had seen the same effect in pre-war demolition zones when foremen used tiny charges to test collapse patterns. A single controlled dust plume stood out even on chaotic sites where workers yelled and machines blasted concrete. The battalion needed a retreat signal. Collier whispered that if they did not fall back soon, they would be encircled. Art listened to the descriptions. 3rd Platoon stalled 2 blocks west. 1st Platoon had retreated behind a blown-out cafe after losing a squad. Enemy infantry moved through connecting courtyards. No one had eyes on the overall situation. Art knew that if the retreat command did not reach every fragment of the line at the same moment, isolated pockets would be wiped out one by one. Radios were dead. Flares were useless. Runners would not survive open streets. Art told the sergeant he had an idea. Collier stared, waiting for something grounded. Art explained how brick dust behaved under controlled detonation. He described its visibility in smoky air. He talked about time plumes, height variation, and color contrast. Collier frowned. To him, dust was dust. The idea sounded absurd. Art insisted that he could create a 2-plume sequence that acted as a clear signal. 1 short blast meant prepare to move. 1 tall plume meant retreat at once. The sequence would be visible through the smoke because red dust carried a deeper tone than ash and insulation. He needed loose brick piles and small charges. He carried 2 demolition caps and enough cord to rig something simple. Collier hesitated. German snipers covered the street. Art would have to expose himself for a moment to place the charges. Yet the sergeant had no alternative. Headquarters had not answered in over 30 minutes. German shells crept closer with each new bracket. The platoon could not stay. Collier finally gave a tight nod. He told Art to try but warned that failure meant they would die in these ruins. Art crawled out of the corner, staying tight against the rubble. Every collapsed building in can produced mountains of mixed debris. Art sifted through a pile of broken brick, feeling the weight, texture, and dryness of each piece. He selected fragments that would produce a bright red plume when pulverized. Mortar dust created a lighter cloud, but red brick gave the color punch he needed. He placed the chosen material in a shallow pocket between 2 fallen beams and wrapped his demolition cord around it. He worked fast, hands steady even while machine gun bursts cracked overhead. He tucked the first cap under the material for a low plume, then moved to a second location for the tall plume charge. The second charge required a slightly larger debris mass and a more open space to allow vertical lift. He crawled back to cover and explained the sequence once more to Collier. The sergeant related to the nearest men. They repeated it quietly. Low plume meant get ready. Tall plume meant retreat. Men scoffed. Some said the idea would blend into the background haze. Art ignored them. He had watched dust behave under far worse conditions. The timing mattered. The placement mattered. The height mattered. If the charges worked, the signal would cut through the chaos for just long enough. German mortar rounds struck 50 meters away. The ground shook hard. Art gripped the detonator and waited for the next lull. A brief silence fell over the block. He ignited the first charge. A sharp crack jumped across the ruins. A red plume shot up to waist height, holding its shape for a second before thinning into the drifting haze. Collier's eyes widened. The plume did not vanish. It stood out. The color contrast and angle made it distinct. Some soldiers spotted it at once. Others pointed with quick shouts. The signal traveled faster than any runner could sprint. Even through smoke, the men to the right flank saw it. Art waited 2 seconds, counting slow and controlled. He triggered the second charge. The blast threw a taller column of red brick dust straight up, reaching nearly shoulder height before collapsing into drifting particles. This plume held longer. Its shape was clear in the filtered afternoon light. Across the district, men hidden in basements and hallways saw both plumes. Even those unsure of the meaning felt the urgency of an intentional signal in a place where nothing was coordinated. Art watched their silhouettes shift. Rifles lifted. Packs tightened. Heads turned toward withdrawal routes. The signal had reached them. Collier whispered that it worked far better than expected. Art stayed alert. This was only the first test. The retreat still had to happen under fire. But the dust plumes had cut through everything, proving that even in smoke-choked urban combat, the right material used with precision could replace a failed doctrine. German mortar fire intensified across the block. Each new impact scattered loose debris and pushed thicker waves of gray haze into the ruined street. Jenkins pressed himself against the brick spine of the collapsed structure and listened to the platoon shifting positions. Collier signaled for squads to pull back in staggered groups once the avenue opened. The dust plumes had served their purpose. Now the retreat needed to move with discipline before the Germans tightened their encirclement. The danger grew with every second. Enemy patrols moved between shadowed alleys, probing for weak points, while sniper rounds cracked from upper windows that still had partial cover from shattered masonry. Art kept scanning the field, checking whether any dust remnants still drifted at recognizable heights. He noticed how the air acted around the freshly disturbed debris. The intense heat from burning furniture and timber created narrow channels of rising warm air. The dust plumes he crafted had ridden these currents for a brief moment, rising just enough to create a visual cue. These dynamics were familiar to him. Pre-war demolition work often took place in confined spaces where dust patterns changed with subtle temperature differences. Art saw the battlefield the same way he saw construction sites that had collapsed during controlled tests. Instead of seeing chaos, he saw airflow. Instead of smoke, he saw gradients. Instead of rubble, he saw material types interacting with blast force. Collier crawled back beside him and gave a half grin. For a second the sergeant almost looked relieved. Then gunfire ripped down the street and flattened 2 men who tried to move too quickly. The retreat stalled. Art peeked around a fragment of wall and spotted the source. A German MG-42 team had repositioned behind a destroyed tram car. Its metal frame created a narrow firing slit. Every time someone tried to cross the open road, the gun fired in short, disciplined bursts. They cut the air with such speed that the bullets sounded like tearing cloth. The retreat could not continue until the gun fell silent. Art studied the tram car and the haze around it. The gunner's visibility was limited, but he could still spot movement. The men needed concealment. Art knew dust could serve as visual disruption as well as a signal. He searched his pack for leftover materials. He had 1 partial charge, just enough to create a large dust cloud if used correctly. He did not need a plume this time. He needed a wall. A fast eruption of red dust and mortar powder would blind the enemy team for a few seconds. Those seconds would buy the platoon enough time to cross the kill zone. Collier raised a brow when Art explained the idea. The sergeant reminded him that the last charge might be needed later. Art argued that later did not matter if they died here. Collier gave quick approval. Art prepared the charge, packing loose brick fragments around the cap. A true demolition charge would have been too powerful, but this mixture would break apart instantly on detonation and create a thick column of red particulate that expanded sideways. He placed the charge behind a slab of broken concrete that leaned at an angle toward the tram car. The angle mattered. The slab would redirect the explosion upward and outward, creating a wider cloud. Art returned to cover and waited for the next moment of enemy adjustment. The MG team paused to reload. Art triggered the detonator. The explosion snapped sharply off the stone. A violent burst of red and pale dust surged forward and rolled across the open street like a fast-moving curtain. The particles struck the tram car and rose upward, forming a dense veil that blocked the gunner's vision. Men shouted for movement. The squad surged through the haze in two waves. Boots scraped rubble. Rifles rattled against gear. The haze swallowed everything beyond a few feet. The Germans fired blindly but hit nothing. Within seconds the platoon reached the connected courtyard network on the western side of the district. The retreat route remained dangerous but no longer suicidal. Once in the courtyards, the men spread into shallow trenches formed by fallen walls. Art remained behind briefly to ensure no stragglers remained. Collier insisted he move. Art shook his head until he saw the last two riflemen slip across the rubble into safety. Only then did he follow. Inside the courtyards, the men regrouped behind a wrecked garden wall. The smell of burned insulation mixed with the sweet, sharp odor of old plaster dust. Art leaned against a cracked pillar and caught his breath. One of the younger soldiers stared at him and muttered that he never expected brick dust to save their lives. Art simply said that demolition work taught him more than the army ever realized. Another runner approached from 1st Platoon. The runner's sleeve was torn and soaked in blood. He explained that 1st Platoon saw the dust signals clearly and had already pulled back to the secondary line of defense. They wanted confirmation of whether 3rd Platoon was moving. Collier gestured toward Art. The runner blinked when told that the retreat signal had come from a civilian demolition technique. He thanked them and sprinted off to update his lieutenant. Art listened to distant impacts. German forces continued to shell the abandoned street, unaware the platoon had already dispersed. The dust signals had bought time and reduced casualties. Yet Art knew one success did not validate a method. He needed repeated reliability. On a battlefield, any technique that worked once could fail the next time under slightly different conditions. Materials changed with humidity. Visibility shifted with temperature. Explosion angles altered dust density. Art understood that replicating the signals required consistent debris types and precise placement. His mind kept working. He compared the plume heights, duration, and spread of each blast. He tracked how far the signals reached. He mapped the airflow paths mentally. Collier walked over and asked how long the charges would remain feasible in this district. Art said that as long as buildings contained red brick and dry mortar, the signals could work. But he warned that in rain or deeper smoke saturation, visibility could drop. Collier nodded and suggested they might need the technique again before nightfall. Battalion still had no communication link. The enemy pressed in from the northern blocks. They needed a way to coordinate movement between shattered units. The sergeant left to speak with the officers. Art stayed behind and examined the walls around him. The courtyard held several collapsed structures. He studied their material composition. One building used a darker clay brick that produced a browner dust. Another used pale limestone that created a white plume but lacked contrast against smoke. He dismissed the limestone. He focused on two piles of red brick pieces. They matched the material from the earlier charges. He tested one fragment between his fingers. It crumbled easily. Good. That meant a controlled detonation would create a strong vertical plume. A corporal approached and asked whether the dust idea had rules. Art explained that the technique used timing and height, not color alone. Red brick dust only worked because it contrasted with the gray battlefield haze. The corporal suggested creating multiple sequences. Art agreed. They needed at least 3 signals. Prepare. Retreat. Hold position. Each required a specific plume height and rhythm. Art instructed him to gather small debris piles into separate spots close to cover. While they worked, German small arms fire peppered the garden walls. Enemy patrols were searching the courtyards. If the platoon did not move soon, they would be trapped again. Collier returned and told them the officers wanted Art to prepare another sequence. This time the signal would coordinate movement across 3 platoons. That meant the plume had to be visible across 2 entire blocks of ruins. Art considered his options. The secondary courtyard had an opening where warm air from fires funneled upward. If he placed the charge at the base of that opening, the plume would lift higher before dispersing. Height mattered more than width for long-distance visibility. He prepared 2 charges, one smaller and one medium-sized. He placed the first in a sheltered crevice to produce the short plume. He placed the second near the vertical airflow path. He finished positioning them and stepped back into cover. Collier crouched beside him and asked if he was ready. Art nodded. Art waited for a brief pause in enemy fire. The courtyard trembled under distant impacts. Smoke drifted in uneven layers over broken beams and uprooted tile. Men watched him with tight jaws. Their lives depended on Dust behaving exactly as he predicted. Art raised the first detonator. A sharp pop broke through the courtyard. A low red plume rose just above knee height. It held steady for a moment before thinning into the haze. The nearest platoon saw it at once. They shifted into ready positions. Art counted 3 seconds and triggered the second charge. This detonation hit deeper into the debris bed and rode the warm air current. The plume shot upward fast and straight. It climbed higher than any previous signal. The red dust column reached nearly twice a man's height before it stretched thin and dissolved into drifting smoke. The shape stood out clearly against the gray background. Men across both blocks saw it. Officers shouted to begin movement. Platoons rose from trenches and pushed toward the fallback route in measured groups. Collier glanced at Art with something close to respect. Movement began smoothly. Soldiers filed through narrow passageways in disciplined lines. Some carried wounded men on improvised stretchers made from door planks. Mortar shells fell behind them, blanketing the avenue they had abandoned. German patrols advanced into the dust cloud that still lingered above the old street. Their silhouettes shifted behind layers of haze. Art watched the pattern unfold. His signal had not only coordinated the retreat but also misled the enemy into shelling empty positions. Art moved with Collier toward the next cover point. As they crossed a courtyard, a sniper round snapped past Art's ear. He ducked behind a toppled chimney block. The shot came from a second-story window in a half-collapsed residence. Art scanned the structure. Snipers loved elevated firing angles where smoke was thinner. But this building had a weakness. The top floor leaned over a shattered support beam. A small demolition cap placed correctly would dislodge the brickwork just enough to force the sniper to relocate. Art had no charges left. But he recognized a solution. A large slab of brick rested precariously above a cracked archway. A strong push would cause it to fall. Collier and another soldier moved with him. Art pointed to the slab and explained the idea quickly. The 2 men braced themselves and shoved hard. The slab groaned and then collapsed. It crashed into the open doorway below, sending a thick burst of dust upward. The plume wrapped around the broken staircase leading to the sniper's perch. The sniper retreated instantly. His line of sight vanished. The platoon used the distraction to move through the cross corridor. Art looked back once at the swirling dust. What civilians considered rubble, soldiers considered terrain. To him, terrain included materials, density, fragmentation, flow. He saw a battlefield of elements that most men ignored. It gave him a small advantage in a war that consumed advantages by the hour. Once the platoon reached a sheltered alleyway, the officers gathered around Collier and Art. They wanted to know how the dust signal worked and whether it could be repeated under new conditions. Art described the need for dry brick powder, consistent debris piles, predictable airflow and controlled detonation angles. The officers listened and exchanged quick glances. One lieutenant asked if Art could create variations for more complex coordination. Art said that was possible but riskier. Too many patterns would confuse men already exhausted and disoriented. 3 signals were optimal. Prepare. Retreat. Hold. Anything more would blur under pressure. A captain approached and informed them that contact with higher command was still gone. The battalion fought in scattered pockets with no central timing. Dust signals might be the only way to synchronize actions through the ruins. He told Art to begin teaching the technique to non-commissioned officers so they could replicate it without direct supervision. Art hesitated. Dust signals were not intuition. They required understanding of materials and blast effect. But he had no choice. If he became a casualty, the tactic would die with him. They needed redundancy. Art gathered several sergeants and corporals in a shaded corner of the courtyard. He demonstrated how brick crumbled between fingers, how fragments behaved when struck, how airflow changed the lift of particulate, and how color contrast affected visibility. The men listened but struggled to see the patterns he saw. Art explained again more slowly. He showed them examples. He pointed at specific debris piles. He made them crumble bricks with their own hands. Some began to understand. Others nodded without comprehension. One corporal asked why mortar dust could not be used alone. Art said mortar dust dispersed too fast and lacked color strength. Another asked why smoke bombs could not serve the same purpose. Art told him smoke bombs acted as landmarks, not signals. They spread too slowly and lacked height control. Dust plumes were sharp, fast, and precise. They appeared and vanished within seconds. That gave them clarity. While they talked, a distant explosion echoed from the northern block. German troops pushed hard against the flank. The captain announced that they needed to reposition immediately. Art prepared to pack the rest of his gear, but Collier stopped him. The sergeant whispered that Art needed rest. Art shook his head. Predicting dust behavior took mental clarity. Fatigue clouded judgment. But stopping now meant risking failure on the next signal. They moved again through a twisting path of alleys and half-collapsed rooms. The ground shook under tank rounds that struck distant structures. Dust drifted from ceilings with every impact. Art studied the ruins as he walked. Every collapse revealed material differences. Some walls used mixed brick types that produced inconsistent plumes. Others used reinforced concrete that absorbed blast force instead of dispersing it. The viability of the dust technique depended on choosing the right buildings. Art marked those locations mentally. The platoon reached another defensive hold point. From here they could see deeper into the district. Smoke rolled across rooftops. Fires burned in broken attics. The air shimmered from heat. Retreating units had formed a loose line behind overturned carts and collapsed storefronts. The enemy advanced methodically. They would reach the new line within minutes. Officers needed to time a coordinated shift south to avoid encirclement. Art told Collier the next dust plumes required higher vantage points to reach the entire sector. Collier pointed to a partially collapsed textile factory with an open roof. Art checked its structure. The factory's upper walls were made of red brick with minimal mortar. Perfect material. The ground floor had collapsed inward, leaving a sloped ramp of debris that climbed to a broken platform near the roof. Art climbed the debris ramp with 2 soldiers. The height gave them clear airflow. He selected bricks from a shattered wall section and broke them into smaller pieces with the butt of his rifle. He explained the need for fine fragmentation to produce tall plumes. The soldiers helped create debris piles for the next sequence. The wind shifted lightly, but the factory interior still had enough vertical heat channels from nearby fires to lift dust if the charges were placed correctly. He prepared 2 plumes again. 1 short signal. 1 tall. This time the tall plume needed to be even more prominent to reach multiple platoons spread across the ruins. Art packed more debris around the charge and positioned it near the sloping airflow path. Down below, Collier waited for confirmation. Art gave a thumbs up. The next signal would decide whether 3 platoons escaped being enveloped by German infantry closing in from the northeast. He braced himself and lifted the detonator. Art tightened his grip on the detonator and waited for the soundscape to shift. A brief silence followed a distant mortar volley. That was the opening he needed. He fired the first charge. A crack echoed through the factory ruins. A short red plume rose cleanly just above waist height before dissolving into the drifting haze. The platoons along the defensive line saw it at once. Men adjusted formation and prepared to shift positions. Art counted the necessary seconds and triggered the tall plume charge. The second explosion sent a forceful column of red dust straight upward. It rode the warm air rising through the destroyed roof. The plume climbed fast and stabilized at full height before fading. Officers across 3 blocks saw it. They shouted the order to shift south. Units moved through narrow alleys, crossing broken courtyards in tight formations. The signal reached everyone. Art watched the movement unfold and felt a surge of quiet relief. His technique continued to hold under changing conditions. Enemy troops advanced into the abandoned positions. They fired blindly through the haze left behind. German soldiers assumed the defenders still hid somewhere in the ruins. Their mistake bought the retreating platoons more time. Art climbed down from the factory platform and regrouped with Collier. They followed the rest of the units south through a maze of shattered homes. Art could see exhaustion in the men's faces. Dust caked every fold of their uniforms. Their eyes squinted through the drifting debris. Collier pulled Art aside. He told him that the captain wanted him at the forward coordination point. Art followed without hesitation. When they reached the designated cellar, several officers faced him with urgent expressions. They explained that 2 more platoons to the east were still pinned. Radio contact remained dead. If those units did not receive a signal soon, they would be cut off and overrun. Art asked about the visibility conditions. The officers said the eastern district burned hotter. Smoke rose thickly but opened in narrow pockets. Dust plumes could work, but placement would be difficult. Art requested details. The officers showed him a rough sketch of the area. Shell fire had caused multiple partial collapses along one side of the street. The rubble leaned inward, forming channels where warm air vented upward. Those vents could lift a plume higher if triggered at the right moment. Art examined the sketch and considered the airflow patterns. He asked for a guide who knew the area. A corporal stepped forward and offered to lead him. They moved quickly, ducking under leaning beams and stepping over piles of shattered tile. The eastern district smelled of burned rubber and scorched timber. Fires smoldered inside broken attics. Art scanned the air. Smoke drifted sideways at irregular intervals. Heat rising from collapsed structures created small vertical streams. Perfect for plume lift. They reached a half-collapsed bakery. The rubble formed a steep incline leading to a fractured upper wall still holding patches of bright red brick. Art studied the debris. The brick was dry. The fragments were sharp-edged. Exactly what he needed. He instructed the corporal to clear a narrow pocket in the debris to create space for the charges. While the corporal worked, Art broke brick fragments into smaller pieces, focusing on consistency. Even particulate size created stronger color concentration. He piled the fragments with precise layering. Art sensed the airflow. It pulsed upward in intervals as fires shifted. Timing mattered more here than anywhere so far. If he detonated too early, the plume would sink into the smoke. Too late and the plume would tilt sideways. He positioned 2 piles. One for the short signal. One for the tall plume. Both aimed toward rising heat vents. Collier arrived with 2 more soldiers. They secured the perimeter. Art finished packing the charges into the debris. He checked the density of each pile and repositioned some brick dust until the texture felt right in his hands. The corporal asked how he always knew where dust would travel. Art said years of demolition work taught him patterns. Walls spoke when they fell. Dust trails told stories. Most men saw destruction. He saw structure. Collier asked how long they had until the enemy advanced. The corporal answered 4 minutes, maybe less. Art scanned the area. He listened to the fires. He waited for the rising current to strengthen. When the heat pulse surged through the vent, he prepared the detonator. Soldiers crouched low. Officers watched from the courtyard entrance. Art fired the first charge. The explosion burst through the rubble with a crisp blast. The red plume rose knee-high and held for a moment. The visibility was imperfect, but the plume still stood out. Officers from both eastern platoons saw it. Art waited for the heat pulse to peak again. He triggered the second charge. The tall plume shot upward with surprising force. It rode the heat vent perfectly and climbed into a clear pocket of air above the burning roofs. It stood like a sharp column of color against the surrounding smoke. Men across the eastern district recognized it instantly. They began a coordinated withdrawal into the backup trenches. German troops continued pushing forward, unaware the defenders had already shifted. Art watched the plume collapse slowly into scattered dust. It performed exactly as needed. Officers confirmed via hand signals that the eastern platoons were moving. The coordinated withdrawal continued. Without the plume, those units would have fallen into a tightening trap. The platoons moved south toward a more defensible line. Art followed Collier into a narrow alleyway that led to open ground behind a row of collapsed workshops. Here, a temporary command post had formed. Officers from multiple units gathered to reassess their new position. Art stood off to the side while they debated the next steps. A lieutenant approached him. He said the commanders wanted to formalize the dust signal into a temporary system for the duration of the battle. Art would need to teach additional NCOs and oversee the gathering of proper materials. They required enough charges for at least 6 more signals. Art nodded. He knew the workload would be heavy, but the method had proven its worth. As long as conditions remained dry enough, the plumes would continue to function. He stepped outside the command post. The air was thick with suspended debris. Fires burned low along distant streets. Tank engines growled somewhere near the northern block. Art observed how the wind patterns changed as the evening approached. Cooler temperatures altered the behavior of dust. Plumes would not rise as easily in colder air. He needed to account for that. He walked the edge of the defensive line with Collier. They inspected potential plume sites. Some debris piles were too wet. Others were too coarse. They selected 3 strong locations. Each spot had the right balance of dry brick, open airflow, and partial cover for concealment. Art marked them with chalk taken from a broken crate. As they moved, soldiers whispered about the dust technique. Some still thought it a strange idea. Others saw it as a lifeline. Collier told them to trust the signals completely. Doubt cost lives. Uniform understanding mattered more than innovation. Art returned to the command post and briefed the officers. They approved his plan for new signal sites. He explained the need for consistent debris handling and proper spacing. The officers agreed to assign extra men to help prepare the piles. They wanted the next signal ready before dusk. Art left to begin the work. Another moment of silence fell across the ruined district. The next phase of the battle approached, and the dust signals would decide whether the units survived the night. Art moved through the ruins with Collier and a small group of soldiers assigned to help him prepare the next series of plume sites. The evening air shifted again. Temperature dropped. Smoke from distant fires hung lower. The reduced lift worried him. Dust signals relied on heat currents. Without that vertical push, the plumes might stay too low to be seen across multiple blocks. Art paused at each selected site and tested the air with simple gestures. He let dust fall from his fingertips and watched how quickly it dropped. The men watched him with quiet curiosity. To them it looked like superstition. To Art it was measurement. They reached the first site, a collapsed warehouse that contained dry brick under the upper layers of debris. Art cleared a shallow depression with careful movements, removing the heavier fragments and spreading the fine brick dust evenly. He explained that a plume needed both weight and lightness. Too heavy and it fell instantly. Too light and it dispersed sideways. The men nodded slowly, beginning to understand the balance. Art packed the pile and stepped back. The second site sat near the corner of a ruined metal workshop. The collapsed roof created a trough that channeled warm air outward from fires burning in the far interior. This airflow compensated for the cooling evening air. Art tested the drift again. The plume here would rise. He ordered the men to gather more red brick fragments. They broke pieces with rifle butts and crushed them under boots until the debris reached a fine, even texture. Art added some coarse pieces to give the plume initial momentum. He shaped the pile with deliberate precision. The third site caused hesitation. The debris was perfect, but the surrounding cover was scarce. Art would need to expose himself if he triggered a charge here. Collier studied the angles and pointed out a section of wall that could protect Art from sniper fire. Art accepted the risk. He knelt near the debris and sifted through a handful of brick dust. It felt too moist. Moisture would kill the plume. He searched deeper under the rubble until he found dry material. He built the pile exactly as he wanted it and marked the blast point with a small rock chip. Art returned to the command post. Officers reviewed the placements and approved the plan. They needed a hold signal first, then a retreat signal later if the enemy pushed too far into the sector. The hold signal required clarity. It needed to be unmistakable. Art recommended a 3-plume sequence. 1 short, 1 medium, 1 short again. He cautioned that this pattern should never be used for any other purpose. The officers agreed. They repeated the sequence among themselves until everyone knew it. Art sat for a moment on a broken crate. His hands trembled slightly. The day consumed his energy. He had never expected his demolition skills to become a battlefield communication tool. He thought of his pre-war job. Long days lifting heavy brick. Long nights studying demolition manuals. He had always enjoyed controlled collapse. It was clean and predictable. War was not. War was messy. Yet here he was using the same principles in a place where nothing was clean or predictable. Collier noticed his exhaustion and told him to rest. Art shook his head again. He had to oversee the next phase. Night shadows crept across the ruins. Fires flickered in broken homes. German troops advanced in cautious steps, probing the new defensive line. Art observed their movement from a concealed position. The enemy tested the trenches with machine gun bursts and mortar fire. They pushed harder on the eastern flank. Officers signaled for readiness. The hold signal would be needed soon. Art moved to the first plume site with Collier and 3 soldiers. He placed the short plume charge and checked the debris one last time. The air shifted. The heat current strengthened. Perfect. He stepped behind cover. Collier asked for confirmation. Art nodded. He triggered the first charge. The short plume rose and faded as intended. Officers along the line saw it. They readied their men. Art began moving toward the second site but froze when new shelling erupted across the district. A heavy barrage targeted the southern road. Dust rained from rooftops. For a moment he worried the smoke saturation would obscure the next plume. He evaluated the air quickly. The path was still clear enough. He reached the second site. He triggered the medium plume. The dust column climbed and spread in a wider arc. Its longer duration gave officers extra time to confirm the signal. Soldiers steadied their positions behind rubble. Some adjusted their angles of fire. The line prepared to hold. Art sprinted with Collier toward the third site. Sniper fire cracked overhead. They dropped behind a broken chimney column. The third charge sat exactly where he left it. The air moved in slow pulses. He watched for the right moment. A brief warm drift rose from a burning attic nearby. Art squeezed the trigger. The short plume lifted cleanly. It vanished in seconds. The signal was complete. The officers relayed the hold command. The line stiffened. Enemy troops attempted a push but encountered a wall of coordinated fire. Machine gun teams opened sustained bursts. Riflemen targeted. Advancing silhouettes through narrow gaps in the rubble. Mortar crews adjusted their angles. The dust signal unified the defense. Without it, scattered squads might have fired too early or too late. Timing kept the line intact. Art and Collier returned to the command post. Officers thanked him. Some expressed disbelief that a civilian demolition technique created order in a chaotic battle. Art shrugged. He did not see the work as clever. He saw it as necessary. Someone needed to read the battlefield through materials the way he always had. If dust could carry instructions, he would use it. The captain stepped forward with new information. Scouts reported heavier German reinforcements moving from the northeast. If they broke through, the entire sector would collapse. Officers planned a controlled withdrawal to a stronger position several blocks south. But the retreat had to be synchronized or units would be cut down while moving. Radios remained silent. Art understood what the captain wanted before he said it. They needed the tall plume again. Art asked about timing. The captain said within 15 minutes. Art nodded and requested 2 extra men to help prepare fresh debris at the tall plume site. Moisture levels changed quickly at night. Dust that worked an hour ago might not work now. Art returned to the third site and checked the material. The top layer felt damp. Unusable. He scraped deeper until he reached dry brick fragments. He directed the men to crush them into fine pieces. They worked fast but carefully. Art packed the tall plume pile. He checked airflow. The current was weak. The plume might not rise high enough. He tested small handfuls. Some drifted upward slowly. Enough for the signal. But timing would be critical. He would have to wait for a burst of warm air caused by shifting embers in the nearby wreckage. The command post signaled that the retreat window approached. Art listened for the sound of fire shifting. A faint crackle rose from the collapsed workshop. The heat pulse came. Art triggered the detonator. The plume erupted into a tall column of red dust. It climbed higher than any evening plume so far. Officers spotted it immediately. Command spread across the defensive line. Platoons began the withdrawal. Movement synchronized again through ruins where communication should have been impossible. The retreat flowed smoothly. No squads lagged behind. No units fled too early. Art watched the plume collapse into scattered particles and felt the weight of responsibility lift from his chest. The dust signal carried them again. The retreat carried the platoons into a cluster of sturdier stone buildings that formed a natural choke point. Officers guided the men into defensive positions while scouts confirmed the enemy's distance. The Germans pressed hard into the vacated district, unaware the defenders had regrouped in stronger terrain. Art stayed with Collier near the entrance of a shattered courtyard and watched the dust settle along the old line. The plumes had done all they could for the day. Art sensed the strain in every muscle. His hands shook lightly. Fatigue blurred the edges of his vision. Collier told him he had done more than anyone expected. Art nodded without speaking. He listened to the distant gunfire and felt an odd stillness spread through him. He had improvised a communication system out of pulverized brick, dry mortar, and air currents. He had turned demolition experience into battlefield coordination. He felt no pride, only relief that the men lived. The captain approached and said higher command finally restored partial communication. Reports of the dust signal spread across the battalion. Officers requested written notes so they could study the technique. Art explained the basics. He told them the method depended on materials, airflow, debris density, and timing. He emphasized that the signals were situational. They worked because the ruins of Can provided the right conditions. They would not apply to open fields or forest combat. The captain understood. He said the technique would be documented as the Jenkins dust signal. Art looked at the rubble stretching across the northern district. Men died in those ruins hours earlier. The dust plumes honored them in a way. They turned a collapsed city into a tool for survival. Collier stood beside him and said the men would not forget what happened today. Art said memory mattered less than survival. Soldiers fought to see another day. Innovation served that purpose. Night settled over Cannes. Fires dimmed into scattered embers. The dust drifted in slow waves across the streets. The battalion reorganized under new orders. Art sat against a broken pillar and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of home. He thought of demolition sites where dust rose cleanly under controlled blasts. War twisted those memories into something harsher, but the principles remained the same. Units rotated watch through the night. Art slept briefly, waking often to distant impacts. At dawn the ruins looked different. Sunlight cut through the drifting haze and revealed the destruction in sharp detail. Officers reviewed casualty lists. They compared them to expected losses for a full encirclement. The numbers were lower than predicted. The dust signals saved men. After the battle, word of the technique reached senior officers. They studied the Jenkins dust signal and noted its narrow applicability. It became a recognized but rare tool. Urban combat sometimes required low-tech innovation when radios failed and visibility collapsed. Art never saw himself as an inventor. He simply read the battlefield through the materials he understood best. He survived the war and returned to demolition work. Colleagues asked about the stories from Can. He told them dust behaved the same under fire as it did on a construction site. Only the stakes changed.